Lebanon, Ohio, 1871. A Christmas Eve barroom brawl led to a murder trial. The defense attorney was a controversial figure who had a conviction in his past. As the murder trial got underway, he was determined to prove his client was innocent, but his method was both shocking and fatal. It's the History of Murder, and I'm your host, Clare O'Donoghue. On December 24, 1870, in Hamilton, Ohio, at a saloon known as the American, a group of men were in an upstairs room playing cards. Thomas Myers joined the card players in a game of faro. It was apparently a rousing game, interrupted a little after 8 that evening. Thomas McGeehan and 4 other men came into the room and attacked Myers with slingshots. Not a slingshot, a slingshot. That's a rock or other heavy object tied to a rope. The other end of the rope is tied to the assailant's wrist so he can fling the slingshot without losing the weapon. Myers reacted to the attack by jumping to his feet and grabbing his pistol. Reportedly, he had trouble getting the gun from his trousers, and as he was struggling, he was shot. He fell to the floor but stumbled up again, shooting wildly, hitting no one, before falling a second time and dying. The room had been quiet during the moments that Myers was dying, but suddenly there was pandemonium. What had exactly happened? Who had shot Myers?
Before we continue, please remember to leave a comment, like the video, and subscribe to our channel. It will help us continue to make new content. Now, back to the story.
There were several men in the room, but in the days that followed, only Tom McGeehan was arrested. He and Myers had bad blood, and beyond the issues with the victim, Tom was not a well-liked man. According to Martin Gottlieb, journalist and author of Lincoln's Northern Nemesis, Tom McGeehan had quite a reputation.
He was notorious. McGeehan was involved with selling whiskey. He was a member of some sort of whiskey ring, it was referred to.
He had previously been charged with counterfeiting and fraud, and was called bold and determined, which is either a compliment or an insult, depending on who is saying it. And for Tom, it could be either. He had friends, but he had far more enemies. Myers did not have a better reputation. He was rough and difficult. He was described as having, quote, a very bad character for peace and quiet in the community, unquote. Despite his reputation, his death shook those who knew him. Myers' family was well liked and respected, and his death was called cowardly and calculated. Tom McGeehan would have to pay. There was talk of lynching him, and even though local citizens held off on that, there was almost a suffocating intensity at the preliminary hearing. Tom swore he did not shoot Myers. No one seemed to be listening. Whenever evidence was presented against him at the hearing, the crowd would burst into applause. There would be no way to get him a fair trial, unless he had a defense attorney who was willing to do almost anything to defend him. Enter Clement Vallandigham. Vallandigham asked for and was granted a change of venue. The trial would be moved to Lebanon, about 23 miles east. He was an interesting choice for a defense attorney. He was well known, even infamous in Ohio, but it was not the future his family had planned for him, or the one he'd planned for himself.
He was born in 1820 in a little town on the eastern edge of Ohio called Lisbon now. It was called New Lisbon back then. His father was the Presbyterian minister in town, and he brought young boys into the house, nice big house they had, for schooling, and that's where Vallandigham was schooled, in his father's house. I believe he showed an early talent for oratory. I think his father might have thought he was grooming a minister, and one of his brothers did go in that direction. But Vallandigham was always focused on politics.
His college education ended when he got into a disagreement with the school president. He was asked to leave. He ended up getting a law license after future Secretary of War Edwin Stanton gave him the money to cover the legal course.
He starts volunteering to speak at various Democratic events, having come of age as a Jacksonian Democrat, which was the big populist movement in this part of the country at the time. And he'd get on the program, and he'd just blow people away with his oratorical skill. They'd say, look at that kid go. And so he got slated for the state legislature in his early 20s. And he got elected to 2 terms.
He seemed a natural for politics.
His personality was pleasing. People liked him. He was a charming guy. He had the politician's knack for putting people at ease and making them feel like he was really interested in what they were saying.
But after 2 terms in the state legislature, he moved across Ohio to Dayton and began working at a newspaper.
Vallandigham had no real interest in being a journalist by any definition, or, as a matter of fact, a lawyer. It was always politics for him all his life. And so he runs for judge a couple of times and loses. He runs for Democratic nomination for Secretary of State and loses. We get to the 1850s. He's 30 years old. He runs for Congress twice and loses. 3rd time, 1856, he's declared the loser on election night, but it's very close. He protests the outcome, and ultimately, after a long, partisan, ugly fight, comes away with that job, reelected in 58 and 60, but always narrowly.
Though he had been seen as a man that could charm anyone, that didn't seem to translate to Washington.
By the time he was in Congress, he was deeply polarizing. Some people loved him, and some people hated him. And that continued to be the case all his life. Within the Democratic Party, within his district, he was an icon. He was a demigod. You get outside the district, and he really ran into serious trouble over his views, mainly, not really his personality.
Once in Congress, he was a strong advocate for states' rights, including the right to secede, which was an important issue in the years leading up to the Civil War.
He opposed the war, saying that, rejecting the notion that it was an effort to save the Union, as Lincoln said. He emphasized it's a war to greatly, greatly enhance the power of the federal government and the Republicans, keeping in mind that when secession happened, nearly all the people who left Congress were Democrats. So now the Republicans were really in very solid control of the government in Washington, and he was sounding the alarm about that.
At first, Vallandigham made clear he wasn't taking sides on the slavery issue.
He denied, in those days, being pro-slavery. He said he was neutral on the subject. He said it doesn't matter what Northerners think. It shouldn't matter. It should be up to the South. He said what we think about practices in the South shouldn't matter any more than what Americans think about domestic issues in France or Great Britain.
But 2 years into the war, that changed.
By 1863, he's 43 years old, the middle of the war, he flatly embraces slavery. He's now entirely for it, and he's sounding like a slaveholder, using the same kind of language. Slavery is a positive, good thing, even for the slaves, and they're happy. And it's not a necessary evil; it's a positive good. So I think that's fascinating. We like to think of people evolving away from slavery in those days, as many people did. He devolves.
And there was a reason he devolved that had very little to do with slavery itself.
He's very anti-Lincoln. He's passionately anti-Lincoln. As Lincoln went farther and farther in one direction, Vallandigham went farther and farther in the other direction. So Lincoln comes into office. He's not talking emancipation, but things are happening in his first couple of years in office that people like Vallandigham are very much against. Basically, Congress has eliminated slavery in the District of Columbia through compensated emancipation that paid the slave owners. They're welcoming blacks into the Army. They're welcoming escaped slaves into Union camps, all of which Vallandigham is against. And he's saying, no, 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 too much, go back in the other direction. Lincoln doubles down with the Emancipation Proclamation. I think Vallandigham doubles down. Now he's entirely for slavery. There were other things pushing him in the direction of polarization. He was mad about a lot of stuff, but I think polarization is the overarching cause there.
During the Civil War, Ohio sent over 300,000 soldiers to fight on the Union side. On January 14, 1863, Clement Vallandigham made a speech saying these men were fighting for nothing.
After nearly 2 years of more vigorous prosecution of war than ever recorded in history, you have utterly, signally, disastrously, I will not say ignominiously, failed to subdue 10 millions of rebels whom you had taught the people of the North and West not only to hate, but to despise. You have not conquered the South. You never will. It is not in the nature of things possible, much less under your auspices. But money you have expended without limit, and blood poured out like water. Defeat, debt, taxation, sepulchres, these are your trophies. The war for the Union is, in your hands, a most bloody and costly failure.
He accused Lincoln and the Republicans of wanting to institute a monarchy. They used words like tyranny and despotism and monarchy for what he thought they were up to. They were going to eliminate state lines entirely, starting with their takeover of the slavery issue, attack basic American freedoms, including the freedom to dissent from the war policy, but freedom of religion. They were going to force the ministers to support the war. He painted a very, very dark picture. He became nationally the leading spokesman for his point of view, far and away. I mean, there's no number two in that category. And the heart of his pitch against Lincoln was, these people, the Republicans, have caused this war. They are the reason for the war. Now they want you to fight their war. Why should you do that?
His support for the Confederacy had everything to do with Union troops showing up at his house on May 5th of that year. They were there to arrest him.
They take a position outside his house. They call to him. He comes to a bedroom window upstairs in his nightclothes, and he attempts to engage the major in charge. He says, you can't arrest me. I'm a civilian. The Army can't arrest civilians. Nobody's put you in charge. And anyway, I was just exercising my free speech rights. Well, those are two pretty potent legal arguments, but the major is there to discuss the law. He has his orders.
Vallandigham, who had lost re-election to Congress, had violated General Order No. 38, issued by General Ambrose Burnside. It stated that, quote, declaring sympathies for the enemy, unquote, would not be tolerated in the military district of Ohio. Vallandigham was further charged with interfering with recruiting and encouraging desertion among Union troops. A Union major sent to arrest him ignored Vallandigham's arguments that he had no authority.
He orders them to enter the house and to arrest Vallandigham. A picture of them doing that appears on the front page of a national publication called Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper. This is huge news. Everybody's talking about it. Everybody's editorializing about it at a time when editorials were a fairly big part of American political discourse. The war is raging. It's the first week of May, 1863. Battle of Chancellorsville, often seen as the low point in the war for the North. But Vallandigham's getting a lot of attention too.
Abraham Lincoln was criticized for the decision to arrest Vallandigham, which was, to be clear, Burnside's decision, not his. But when Vallandigham continued his argument that he was only exercising his First Amendment right to free speech, Lincoln took responsibility.
Must I shoot a simple-minded soldier boy who deserts, while I must not touch the hair of a wily agitator who induces him to desert?
He made the case very aggressively that Vallandigham must go. He made it in writing. He made it at great length, very emphatically, in a way that everybody knew about it. He said, this guy is interfering with my efforts to man the army. He didn't say the following, but it's what he meant. Who's going to want to fight in a war that can't be won, that's being fought to establish monarchy, and that's being fought on behalf of the tiny black minority? So he makes his decision, I think, at that meeting, and all manner of colorful things flow from that.
Vallandigham did not agree. He did not see himself or his words as traitorous.
I would say that it needs to be understood that although he was against the war, he would deny the charge that he was against the Union or for the Confederacy. He was just against the war. I think that you need to be able to oppose a war policy without being accused of treason. And that's all he did. He never stepped over the line and did anything that was clearly illegal. He just spoke his mind. He made proposals about government policy. That can't be called treason. And he did not consciously do anything that was just obviously illegal. You can make the case, as we said earlier, that Lincoln has legitimate reasons for thinking that what he was doing was undermining the government. But how do you handle that? If he really thinks that this war is a terrible idea, shouldn't he speak up and say that?
But like his views on slavery, that too seemed to change.
At a certain point, the charge of support for the Confederacy becomes a little bit complicated because in 1863, he proposed ceasefire with all armies going home. Well, that would have left the Confederate government in charge of the South, and it certainly looks like support for the Confederacy. He insisted that it would only be temporary, that within 3 years, the two parts of the country would reunite just because they realized how much they had in common. They realized they belonged together, same history, same customs, same laws, values, constitution, all that. They would come back together, and the anti-slavery movement would cease to be an issue because the anti-slavery people would see how much trouble their activism, their position had caused, and they would back off. And when they backed off, the South would come back into the country. Well, he didn't sell that to anybody. I've never heard anybody else say they thought that was going to happen. And so I think you can, if you make the case that, if you can make the case that that was pro-Confederacy, all I can say is he would deny it, but you can make the case.
Clement was convicted by a military tribunal and sentenced to 2 years in prison. But Lincoln had Union soldiers turn him over to the Confederacy rather than have him serve out that sentence.
Here's a guy, after all, who has just lost his re-election bid, and he's not expected to be elected governor of Ohio. But now he's bigger than ever. Everybody's talking about Vallandigham. And some of the members of the cabinet don't want to be accused of putting somebody in prison for speech. So they settle on a sort of middle course between freeing Vallandigham and putting him in prison. They're going to exile him to the South. This is an idea that's just sort of in the air. The idea is these people love, these Southern sympathizers love the South so much, send them to their friends. Maybe they'll be happier there. It's hardly a punishment at all. And maybe this will prevent Vallandigham from becoming a martyr to his cause in the North. So that's the course that Lincoln adopts.
The journey south proved that, although he wasn't a martyr, he did have star power.
In the process of getting him delivered to the South, a very strange and colorful process itself, the Northern Army stopped for a rest at a certain farmhouse in southern Tennessee. The lady of that house was just utterly starstruck to have Vallandigham in her home. She couldn't believe it. Valiant Val himself, oh my God, this is just the coolest thing ever. And that was typical of the way Southerners thought about it. If word got out that he was going to be at some train station or something like that in his travels, a crowd would gather and it'd be entirely positive about him. He was treated very well in the press across the South.
But he faced a problem.
He was associated with the hope that ultimately North and South would be reunited with slavery. Well, any sort of reunification was at this point anathema to the Southern authorities. No, no, no. We have declared our independence. Thousands of our men have died in enforcing that decision. We're going to make good on that decision. So they don't want to be seen even talking to Vallandigham, lest people get the wrong impression that they're softening. So they don't invite him to Richmond, their capital, to talk to their president or anybody near that rank.
Vallandigham, a hero to some, a traitor to others, was a man without a country.
A cartoon appears in the North showing Lincoln and Jefferson Davis playing badminton with Vallandigham as the bird, or shuttlecock, whatever it's called, batting him back and forth as if neither wants him.
Clement left the South and traveled to Canada, where he ran for governor of Ohio from a hotel in Windsor, Ontario. He lost in a landslide. He returned to Ohio in 1864, though he was technically not allowed in the North while the war was still going on. Lincoln ignored his returns, perhaps hoping that Vallandigham had learned his lesson and would stay quiet. He did not. He became the supreme commander of the Order of the American Knights, a secret group that sought to hamper the war efforts of the Union. There was a plan to capture a northern gunboat harbored in Sandusky, but it was discovered before anything was done. And before he could do anything else, the war ended.
He insisted the North could not win this war. He had actually said, if we win the war, he said words very close to this, if we win the war, I will admit I was wrong. But he never came close to admitting he was wrong. And when confronted with that, he said, that's not what I said. What I said was, if we accomplish the goal of reuniting this country in a way that is real unity, not this god-awful mess we have now, then I will admit I was wrong. But given that we have this god-awful mess now, no.
After the war, Vallandigham criticized the Reconstruction, but he also counseled others to stop opposition to post-war plans. He recognized that most in the North supported the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed citizenship and equal protection for all those born or naturalized in the U.S. This included the newly freed Black population. Vallandigham took a new approach to the issue of Black freedom and the war.
He concluded himself that the Democrats needed to stop talking about the war because that was the Republicans' issue. Stop complaining about the post-war constitutional amendments that were enacted to try to foster equal rights for Black people. Move on. Change the subject. And I think that he felt that he had to personally do that because he had been rejected.
He returned to thinking about political office.
I think he was still somewhat of a political laughingstock. The last thing that had happened was he had been rejected by the people of Ohio. So overwhelming. And he was furious. He thought, I'm the one who was paid the price for this party all these years. Been punished in ways nobody else ever gets punished in American politics. And this is the way you're going to treat me? He was just absolutely furious. He then becomes a candidate for Congress in 1968 for his old seat. It's the marquee election nationally. Everybody's talking about it. Everybody's reporting on it. Big shots in both parties are coming to Dayton to campaign for their person. And he thinks he's going to win that election. It comes out very close, but he loses that one too. And by the end, he's focused on an upcoming Senate race in 1872. He wasn't going to give up.
But he also needed to make money, so he became a practicing attorney, which is how 6 years after the end of the war, he became counsel for the defense in a murder trial. He was very skilled in the courtroom. His law partner said he won nearly every criminal case in which they were involved. But this one was going to test those skills. One reason he took it is because he knew Tom McGeehan personally. But there was another reason for taking this case.
For the notoriety, it was an enormously well-known case. And he thought that this case would just make him a nationally prominent lawyer, not just a very good lawyer, but would gain him fame as a lawyer.
The trial began on June 6, 1871, and Vallandigham had several issues. His client was unpopular, and so was he. There was a third problem. One of the men in the bar that night was going to testify against Tom. That man, Jackson Garver, had struggled with Myers on the night of the shooting. Nevertheless, he would say that it was Tom who actually did the killing. Another man had heard Tom when he first walked into the American. Allegedly, Tom McGeehan said about Tom Myers,
"Tom's my meat, upstairs, dead."
Although no one had seen Tom McGeehan with a gun, it was generally believed he had one. The prosecution suggested that he had a gun in his coat pocket and shot Myers through the pocket. They called this method California style. But Vallandigham was convinced that Tom was telling the truth. He had not shot Myers. Vallandigham believed that Myers had shot himself. He believed that when Myers struggled to remove the gun from his trousers, the gun had accidentally gone off. No one watching the scene in the bar that night thought of that, and so they pointed fingers at the least liked man in the room. Ballistics was not widely used at the time. It was linked to some cases in London as early as 1835, but wasn't developed as a forensic science until the 1920s. In 1871 Ohio, the bullets were not checked. The other thing that was not checked was Tom's coat, which would have shown evidence of a hole in the pocket if he had shot the gun the way the prosecution described. The man who testified for the prosecution, Jackson Garver, said that Tom had burned the coat he was wearing, so it could not be checked. Vallandigham was sure that the best way to convince the jury was through a demonstration of what had happened that night. One question he had was about powder burns. Apparently there was none on Myers' clothing, and Vallandigham wanted to know if all shots left powder burns or if it was possible that Myers had somehow discharged the gun without leaving trace evidence. Vallandigham was staying at the Lebanon House Hotel. He got a piece of white cloth from the owner of the hotel and joined 3 friends for a little experiment. They went to the edge of town, and using a new gun identical to the one in evidence, Vallandigham shot through the cloth.
He went out and he was just trying to see how big a hole a certain bullet would make in a certain cloth at a certain distance, that sort of thing.
They shot twice, and satisfied with the results, headed back to the hotel. One of the men cautioned that the gun still held 3 bullets and suggested that they be discharged in case Vallandigham accidentally shot someone with it. Vallandigham apparently laughed off the idea.
No danger of that. I am carried in practice with pistols too long to be afraid to have a loaded one in my pocket.
They get back to the inn, the room at the inn in Lebanon, which still exists. They get back there, and there are 2 guns in the room. One that he'd used for his test, one that he was going to use in the courtroom the next day when he delivered his summation. One was loaded and one wasn't.
Vallandigham was excited about his demonstration. He even invited another lawyer to his room to show him how it could be done.
I'll show you how Tom Myers shot himself.
He gets down on the floor, gun in his pocket, puts his hand in his pocket. He's getting up with his other hand. He's doing more than one thing at a time.
Clement turned to the other lawyer.
There. That's the way Myers held. Only he was getting up, not standing erect.
Suddenly there was a flash, the sound of a shot, and Vallandigham moved toward the wall.
My God! I've shot myself!
The gun goes off, shoots him in the abdomen, just exactly as he was describing happened in the Myers case.
He had apparently picked up the wrong gun. Not the one that had been used as evidence in the trial, but the gun still loaded with 3 bullets that he had used earlier. Jurors were also staying at the hotel. At least 4 of them came into the room after the shot. They saw the still conscious Vallandigham writhe in pain. Within minutes, word went through the hotel and the town.
He doesn't die immediately. He's actually alert for a couple of hours, but he knows exactly what he's done. And I think he's just mortified. If he hadn't died of that wound eventually, he would have died of embarrassment.
While Vallandigham lay dying, the trial went on. While his clothes were not checked for powder burns, most seemed convinced that if he had shot himself accidentally, it was reasonable to assume that Myers had as well. When the case went to the jury, the men in the room seemed to weigh Tom's reputation and his attack on Myers against the gruesome demonstration Vallandigham had put on in his hotel room. They couldn't find common ground. They deliberated 24 hours and returned as a hung jury.
I think there were no votes for murder in the first, but there were some votes for on lesser charges, on a lesser charge. But the jury was hung. So another trial was held in Dayton. And this time, McGeehan was found guilty, but the judge found that a certain juror had made up his mind too early, and he invalidated the verdict. So there was a third trial, and this time, McGeehan was found innocent.
Vallandigham had not been there to see the verdict, but in a way, he had gotten his client off. It was his theory of an accidental shooting that was in the public's mind. He had died the day after the shooting, after hours spent in agony. James Vallandigham, Clement's older brother, would describe what he saw as the reaction to his brother's death.
Many of these, the majority in fact, had known the man only by reputation, and many of them had so known him only to hate him as the bold leader of the Ohio Democracy during the turbulent times of 1863. But the somber shadow of the Death Angel's wing had wiped out the dividing lines of party and united all in a common brotherhood of sorrow.
A colleague of Clement's delivered a speech at a meeting of the Dayton Bar Association. He said, quote, "No man that I ever knew or ever heard of lost his life in so dramatic and heroic an exercise of his profession," unquote. Not surprisingly, that was not how others saw his death. Those who had supported the Union side in the war were not mourning. They were not united in the common brotherhood of sorrow. They did not see his death as heroic in any way. One said of the 50-year-old Clement, quote, "Death at his own hand came 50 years too late," unquote. In June of 1875, while drinking at a bar he owned, several shots were fired through an open window, killing Tom instantly. The murder remains unsolved, but one thing is known. It was not an accident. What do you think about this case? Please comment below. And if you liked this story, please subscribe to the channel, hit the like and notification buttons, and let us know if there are cases you'd like us to cover.